as you know, we don't usually hold events on a Friday, but we just couldn't pass up this opportunity. Bob Carr, who spent 10 years as the Premier of New South Wales in Australia, was coming through town, and this was just an awesome opportunity for us to learn more about how PPPs, public-private partnerships, can actually work. We've been working slowly towards this in Georgia, and David Doss, who is with our State Transportation Board, sitting at the table here, can tell you what a struggle it's been to get the impetus, the energy behind the public-private partnerships in transportation. Bob Carr not only came in as Premier on the Labour ticket in New South Wales, opposing public-private partnerships, but 10 years later, when he left, he'd actually added to them. And that's really interesting to find out how he got to that point where he decided that it was necessary. It was a necessary evil, I guess. He was Premier of New South Wales when Sydney hosted the Olympic Games, which of course, as you all know, was the second best Olympic Games behind the one before that. Besides pioneering public-private partnerships in roads, in schools, and in hospitals in New South Wales, his government also overhauled the literacy performance of the state school system. We could use some help in that area too. And they introduced a curriculum based on traditional disciplines and academic rigor. Before he entered politics, he was a journalist. He was with ABC Radio. That's Australian broadcasting, I'm assuming, and not American. And he was with the Bulletin magazine. He's the author of several books. And I actually found this out on Wiki, where you can find anything. He is an acknowledged expert on the lives and times of some of the more obscure presidents and vice presidents of the United States. So Q&A time is going to be really interesting, Mr. Carr. In his free time, he enjoys bushwalking, which I think is the American version of the Australian version of hiking. So I want to welcome Bob, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Rita, it's a real pleasure to be here, a great honour for me to be here. I came to Atlanta first in 1995, just after I'd been elected Premier of New South Wales, to look at your preparation for the Olympics, because ours were coming up in 2000. I came back here for the Games, and I loved the opening ceremony. I thought it captured so much of the flavour of Georgia and of the American South in general. It was a great evening. I've been back here since. I am a devotee of American history. I love American history. And this morning I had half an hour in the Atlanta History Centre, and if any of you haven't seen the exhibition on American Indians, or more particularly on the American Civil War that's there, I recommend you go. The Civil War exhibition, and I've seen many of them. I've seen them in Atlanta and in Washington, and in a lot of other places, is first rate. And I congratulate the Atlanta History Centre on what they've brought to local history. I was elected Premier in 1995 with a commitment to lift tolls on 2 toll roads laid down by the previous Conservative government. It wasn't the biggest policy in our platform, but certainly everyone voting in the state election of that year, especially those who lived in Western Sydney, that were serviced by the toll roads, was aware that I was making that commitment. Well, we all make mistakes. It's how you learn from the mistakes that governs whether you survive or not, and I learned from this one because it was a big mistake. What I discovered was that the toll companies who had these concessions would need to be compensated not just for the lost revenue from the lifting of the toll gates, not just for the revenue foregone for the rest of the concession period, but I would have to compensate them for the loss of the tax advantages that went with this bit of infrastructure investment. And that doubled the cost of us keeping the promise. And my political honeymoon ended pretty quickly when I had to front up and say, I can't keep this promise. And my poll standing took a dive. While I was thinking about the best way to get around this and recover my political fortunes, we had to get Sydney ready for the Olympic Games, and we had no highway from Sydney Airport, just south of the city, to the central business district. It was a stop-start journey through multiple traffic lights, numerous traffic lights, through an old industrial centre of the city, and in peak hour it would take 3/4 of an hour, maybe an hour. We had to fix that up. And our revenues weren't booming in 95, 96, and in state government here and in Australia, you live on your revenues. We settled for the same model that we'd inherited on those two existing toll roads. That is, a concession offered to the private sector to build and operate the road, with the asset returning at the end of the concession period to the government, funded by a toll. My next door neighbour said to me, he said, Bob, he said, for God's sake, get on and build that eastern distributor. And that was the message we were getting back from the community. They were prepared to pay a toll for value, for freeway conditions between the airport and the city, and beyond that. This road was built and it was completed way ahead of schedule by the private sector, and we found that at that moment, when someone could go from Sydney's northern suburbs through the city to the airport and beyond without a single set of traffic lights on freeway conditions, they saw and understood the advantage of high quality tolled roads built and run by the private sector. Now, some of your critics will say to you, well, if the private sector can do it, we know that government can borrow money and borrow it often cheaper than the private sector. Why not government-owned toll roads? And that's a question I'm going to answer when I talk about how economically one of the 6 toll roads that I went on to build, yes, 6 of them, the Premier who promised to lift tolls, ended up building 6 new ones, tolled high quality roads, when one of them went bust economically. And I'll tell you that story. And it makes the point that the public sector is better not doing this, that the transfer of risk to a private sector consortium protects the interests of the taxpayers. What we're talking about here in this little story is a ring road system being built around Sydney. First, now, few of you can see this map, but Sydney, the Opera House, Sydney Harbour, there on the coast. City sprawls, it sprawls like a Los Angeles, like an Atlanta, and a vast population in the western suburbs. Stage by stage, we laid down a ring road around this city so that high quality tolled roads ended up providing, that's 42 kilometres there, just that one there. And that system comprising a ring road was laid down by the previous government with 2 roads and by mine with 6. And here's the killer fact that makes the case for the private provision of these roads under a P3 model. The total capital value of those roads, of that new infrastructure, in Australian dollars, 5.4 billion. 4.6 billion was provided by the private sector. Contribution from the taxpayer was only 800 million. So I'll give you those figures again. That infrastructure, those roads, are worth 5.4 billion, 4.6 mobilised by the private sector. The taxpayer was only required to put in 800 million. So we got ourselves a world-class ring road system, what you call here, I think, a beltway, enabling some fabulous savings in journey time some improvement, huge improvement in air quality, because you end that stop-start movement that the trucking industry is very familiar with, costly and damaging in terms of air quality, and a huge saving in safety. Safety, better air quality, and reduced travel times. One estimate put the value of this new infrastructure at being greater in terms of its benefit to the state economy than the huge container wharf just south of Sydney. As an economic asset, as a bit of competitive economic advantage, this new ring road system provided by the private sector, funded by tolls, is worth as much as our container port in terms of the state economy. Before I get on to two quick case studies that show the hazards and the benefits of this approach, let me just tell you about the policy levers that a government has got. First of all, there's the length of the concession. The 6 roads I'm talking about varied in terms of concession length from 17 years to 48 years. It's something government's got to play with. Obviously, if you're giving concession to a private sector consortium for close to 50 years, your bargaining power is greater in terms of what you get from them. The model for toll movement is again something you negotiate. Cost of living indexation plus. The initial toll is there for bargaining, and I'll talk about how we got into trouble with one project because we were too ambitious. Here's another policy lever government's got. Should government make a contribution to the road? If government puts money into it, it can negotiate a lower toll. If government wants to be pure and say it's a private sector undertaking only, the private sector has got to do everything, even making the connections with the existing road system, they've got to pay for that, then the toll is going to be somewhat higher. You can go one step further, as we did, and require that the winning consortium make a $100 million contribution to general roads funding. But you live with the fact that the toll is going to be spiked even further. So they're the policy tools government has got. Let me take 2 case studies. The first is the most controversial, and it's only now, having been open for nearly 5 years, coming right. And this is not really part of that ring road system. It was a luxury project. It was a 2.2 kilometre tunnel under Sydney. 2.2 kilometres, a short distance, but it gets people east-west, west-east, under the grid-like pattern of the city streets. So instead of being threaded through the CBD, you're whisked under it through a tunnel. Now the private sector was interested in this. Our transport planners had it on their books, but we couldn't afford to do it out of our budget. All our road priorities were in Western Sydney. This was going to be a luxury project. So we said to the private sector, you want it, you'll be paying for it. There'll be no government contribution. They said, we still want to do it. And there was bidding between 3 or 4 consortia to do it. So it's a 2.1 kilometre tunnel underneath Sydney, $680 million Australian. It got rid of 16 sets of traffic lights going one way, 18 sets the other way. It opened 2 months ahead of schedule, and you wouldn't believe it, only 2.1 kilometres, but it got 20 minutes off travel time. Now, that's a huge saving. And as someone who lives and works in Sydney, I've got to say, I can't imagine the city without it. Electronic tolling. The opening toll was relatively high, $3.56 for a mere 2.1 kilometre journey. It was aiming to get 90,000 vehicles out of the city streets and under the city. When it opened, there was a huge controversy. I'd actually retired a few months before the opening, and I'd considered, because I was so certain it was going to be a popular project, of staying in office a bit longer so I could cut the ribbon. It turned out to be enormously controversial. First, there were road works going on even when it opened, improving the streets that we could now improve with the traffic going off those streets and going underneath the city. And that made it look untidy. When people realised that they were paying a toll as high as that, there was a bit of a revolt from a part of Sydney that had never paid tolls before. ironically, the more affluent part. And in this climate, the daily use of the tunnel was way down from the expected 90,000. It was as low as 30,000, and that seemed to be a vote of no confidence in the project. There had been, and this is probably the most important factor, we had, at the request of the City Council, had closed a number of roads to coincide with the opening of this project. So we were open to the criticism that we were funneling traffic into the tunnel by closing off some possible alternatives. In fact, we were taking up an environmental case pushed on us by the City Council that said, you're making it so much easier for traffic to get around, we want some disincentives to more traffic flooding in. So it became very controversial. Before coming to the US on this visit, I rang the new owners of the tunnel because the consortium went under. They didn't make revenue. They went under. But it cost the taxpayers nothing. This great bit of infrastructure stayed in place. They couldn't get a tunnel and air freight it, lift it off the Sydney surface. The people of Sydney got a wonderful bit of infrastructure that gives them that 20 minutes saving in time, in travel times, making an east-west journey and all the rest. The private sector consortium that undertook it was disappointed by the figures. Ownership of the tunnel gravitated to the banks. They sold it to new owners. The new owners told me, and this is as recent as 2 weeks ago, the new owners of the Royal Bank of Scotland and Leighton, that it is now growing, use of the tunnel is growing at 10% per annum. It is now decidedly profitable, and its prospects are even better because of growth on the western side of Sydney's central business district. The key message out of this policy experience is the transfer of risk. If it had been built as a government tollway, and I told you we never had the money for this project, we regarded it as a bit of a luxury, and the traffic figures failed to reach 90,000 a day, they settled at 30,000, it would have been the taxpayers bearing that loss. The risk was all shifted under the P3 model to the private sector. And when they failed to reach the targets that they had volunteered to achieve, there was not a cent of taxpayer money that had to go to this project. There was no subsidy that flowed to the consortium, not a cent. This was a private sector project, and all the risk resides with the consortium. That was mid-2008. At the end of mid-2005, at the end of 2005, another project opened, and it's the longest of the toll roads. It's the 42-kilometre link in Western Sydney. We called it Westlink M7. 1.5 billion compared with the 680 million of the Cross City Tunnel. It was completed in 30 months, 8 months early. It got rid of 48 sets of traffic lights, saving 65 minutes in travel time. Now that's extraordinary. And I had to check that. And there was those traffic lights and an aged road system slowed down movement dramatically. We said to the community of Western Sydney when this was being discussed, listen, you could wait another 12 to 15 years to get these highway conditions and to get it as part of the government roads budget. Or you can get it within 2 years as a tollway. You can pay a toll. Every chamber of commerce in the area, every local mayor, both sides of politics, Conservative and Labor, and both sides of politics at the two levels of government, federal and state, said, no, we want it. The community needs this. We need it for the jobs it will bring, and we need it sooner rather than later, and we will take it as a toll road. The toll varies along the length of the journey, depending on how much of it you travel. What is striking about this is that it was just uniformly popular. There were no complaints. No one could think of anything to object to, and they volunteered to pay a toll to get it. I think the key lesson out of the Sydney experience, Sydney's a city of 4.5 million people, is that the public will accept an argument for a P3 if it delivers infrastructure earlier than they would otherwise have to wait, and if the community and the local council understands the benefits. If there's a warning signal, it's about the government being too pure and saying we won't put any money in, indeed we'll extract something from the winning consortium, and thus spiking the toll. And second, a warning signal about using it as an opportunity to close non-tolled alternatives. They're the two warning signals out of our experience. But there'll be public support for a project that delivers benefits. We've run the P3 model in Australia now with a big desalination plant in Victoria. That's worth $3.5 billion. We've run it with school building and maintenance. Any new school in New South Wales and now in 3 other states is going to be built and maintained by private sector contractors. It's being done in hospitals, not in all hospitals, but where it passes the tests, the private sector will not only build but run the maintenance of hospitals in return for a fee from government, with the asset returning to government, for example, in one case, after 28 years. We used it to get around problems we had with the government railway workshops. We invested in $3.6 billion of new rolling stock, new carriages for our transit system over 30 years, a total of 620 new carriages. We said that the company that builds them, the consortium that builds them, would also do the maintenance. And that was a way of getting maintenance done by more efficient workshops than the pretty inefficient ones that the government had. And that's another advantage that this model provides. One assessment of the P3 experience in Australia is that they come in closer to budget. They more than match traditional projects for delivery times, and out of the review of the very specific Sydney experience with toll roads, I was interested to see that 52% of the public, according to a poll in 2008, favour private delivery. Now, Australia's got more attachment to government doing things in the United States. I found that quite striking. And if the Australian public can be receptive to that, then so I think can other jurisdictions, other communities. There are clear lessons from our experience, but nobody could imagine Sydney now operating without that ring road. And government couldn't have done it. It had to be the mobilisation of private capital on a toll road model. And even from the one project out of the 6 that experienced disappointing results and went belly up, the experience was you design these contracts so that no risk falls on the private sector. The taxpayer doesn't lose the infrastructure. The tunnel stays there, now growing in popularity and profitability for the new private sector owners, but there's no risk falling on the public sector. You design the contract to protect the taxpayer. In the end, I think that's the big case for this. Government has got to nurture the tax dollar. The public, we see in this country, the public won't allow governments to tax and spend without limit. In Europe at the present time, government budgets are constrained. So too in Australia. This has been our experience. It may have some value. Every society is different, but it worked for us. Thank you.
I know we have lots of questions out there. Look at the hands going up. Rogers.
Is the tunnel open to freight traffic or truck traffic as well?
Yeah, all these roads are, yes. Yeah.
So that really lifts a lot of traffic.
It's been fantastic, and getting rid of that endless stop-start movement, which adds so much to the cost of trucking, has been a great advantage of the road transport industry. And it makes paying the toll well worthwhile.
You mentioned the toll price for that short 2.1 kilometre tunnel, and then you've got the 42 kilometre toll road. What's the tolling price on that? Have you found a point at which the public says, okay, the dollars are worth the benefit?
Yeah, the initial toll for the Westlink M7 I just forget at the moment, it might be buried in the small print here, it wasn't much above that high $3.50 toll. So people would feel they were getting value for money.
They were saving an hour of their time.
If they took the full journey.
And that was also a project that the government did and contributed to. Right?
Yes, there was a government contribution to that one. I've got it here. The maximum for Westlink M7 currently is $6.39. That's the maximum.
Is that variable?
Yeah, that one is variable because it's a long journey.
Well, what kind of public outreach programs? You said the public was very enthusiastic and actually demanded a toll road. What kind of outreach program did you use to generate that kind of cooperation?
Not much really. It came back to us from the local business chamber, the Western Sydney Business Chamber, and from local mayors who'd been advocating it. The federal government at that time was Conservative. Mine was a Labor government, and we did a deal with them, so we got federal highway funding flowing into this. So both sides of politics were sponsoring it. That was really the action that produced the climate. When it came to the opening of the toll road, the consortium that built it did a great burst of publicity talking about the benefits and introducing people to the idea of the toll. And what we did learn about out of the Cross-City Tunnel experience was that it's good PR to have a toll-free period of some weeks when the project opens. It gets people used to it.
They're all variable tolls?
No.
How, what's the history of unions and government in your country, and how do they look at the privatization of all of these various services? And in other words, you're cutting into their livelihood. I'm sure that has something to do with what's going on.
Well, I'm the world expert on this. I mean, my party is the Labor Party. It's different from the Democrats here in that the unions are actually part of the party. I mean, they are. Well, I'll just develop the argument and make it sound even worse. So when I go and address my party conference on an annual basis, I'd be looking at 1,000 delegates, and 50% of them were there representing affiliated trade unions. The other 50% were representing the branches. And they blocked me doing something I passionately wanted to do, and that was privatise the electricity industry. The big generators and even the retailers are state-owned in New South Wales. I wanted to flog them off. My party conference blocked me doing that. I had other wins, though. I forced through tort law reform, including reform of the law around workers' compensation insurance. They organised a blockade at Parliament House, the building unions, trying to stop my MPs getting in and voting for the reform package. So I'm an expert in conflicts between government and a unionised workforce. Disputes with the teachers' unions, I was very proud of them. I wore them like a badge of honour as they objected to the new tests we introduced to the school system, the new reports we introduced to the school system, and the wages battle every 3 years. But on these things, I've got to say, there was no union opposition. To the toll roads, I mean, the public sector sort of designed and set these projects up. There's no opposition. I was amazed when Jeff and I were in California to find in Sacramento that the engineers employed by the State Roads Authority are opposed to this model. I faced no opposition to it. In hospitals, there always been a bit of union opposition to the outsourcing of what are known as hospital hotel services, the catering, the laundry, the cleaning. But you've now got, in all Australian states, hospitals being built on the P3 model. The union opposition that seems to exist in California, maybe some other US states, is not something we encountered to these projects. Although, as I said, we encountered it on other things.
Bob, in the United States, when they talk about congestion pricing on the toll roads, a lot of the reaction initially is for some of the public to label them Lexus lanes. Okay, but once people begin to use them, that attitude shifts. Did you have a similar experience?
Yeah, I think if you polled any of these communities and said the government knows you need a new road, do you want it as a toll road or a freeway? They'd say a freeway. We pay our taxes, we want it as a freeway. But if you say to them, the government can't afford to do this now, would you wait another 15 years, or would you take it now as a toll road, as long as the toll's reasonable? I think they'd put their hand up to have it as long as it's value for money, as long as the toll is somehow commensurate with the length of the journey and the saving in travel times.
But on these, when the government makes a contribution, still the contract limits that, am I right in understanding, the contract limits that government contribution is all the government's ever on the hook?
Absolutely. That is crucial to understanding this, that the government is not subject to any payments down the track. The government's got a contract that says this road is with the private sector for 35 or 40 years. They've got these responsibilities. There's no government money at risk. If they go bankrupt because patronage falls away, that's a risk they've taken when they've won the bid.
And do you ever require any group of users to actually use the toll roads, or is it strictly voluntary?
I think we got into trouble with the Cross-City Tunnel when it appeared to be that we were forcing people into it. In fact, we were rearranging the road system for environmental and planning reasons, but it looked like that.
But you never did?
No, you couldn't do that, no.
So last question, do you know when Thomas Jefferson died?
Yes, on July the 4th, 1826.
Well done.
And Adams died on the same day, of course, and his last words were, "Jefferson lives."
Would you talk a little about the technology that's used for the tolls?
Yeah, I couldn't believe that electronic tolling came in only in relatively recent years with so little fuss. You know, when you're running a government, you expect everything that could go wrong to go wrong. And this was something that just happened without a hitch. And it regularised things, and people get a bill in their mail. It was extraordinarily easy. The big gripe we've got, I should say this to be fair, is that some people making their daily journeys can encounter two toll roads. And the cost of that travel starts to get a bit steep for them. And there's a bit of a gripe about it not being one single system. But we never planned it as a single system. It's fallen into place, giving us a ring road system as a result of putting together these half-dozen component parts.
You said your pricing was variable. Was that by the time of the day, or was it an actual dynamic, reading on how much traffic was there, making it more expensive and smoothing demand?
No, it was variable on one of them, depending on the length of the journey, because it's a 42-kilometre road. Only on one road, and it's an old government-tolled road, the Sydney Harbour Bridge, is there a variable price according to time of day. So we've done very little in that area.
Do you apply any of this P3 activity to mass transit in terms of passenger rail, bus service, transit service?
Only with the project I described, the provision of rolling stock to the government system. If there's any metro system added on to the Sydney transit system, it'll be done on a PPP basis. The private sector will run that service, and the appeal to us is it'll be a non-unionised workforce. In fact, any modern metro will have unmanned trains.
One more question, if you don't mind. If a project was proposed that was not profitable or was just frankly a dumb idea, I suppose you wouldn't have any of the private people ready to sign up for doing it. So that would be another control to sort of say it's not a good idea. If the government decided to do it, they might do it anyway, but this is another check and balance.
Yeah, the private sector is pretty sophisticated at this, and they would look at a proposal, they'd look at the patronage figures to the extent you can estimate them. There's no science to that, I've learned. If you look at the cross-city tunnel experience, and they've got to make a decision whether it's a goer or not. Absolutely, it's sort of a self-editing process.
Thank you.
One more.
What kind of contingency plan do you have for the tunnel, for instance, the first company goes under? What if another company doesn't come along because they think it's a dumb idea and it won't work? Who steps in then to take care of it?
The banks ended up owning it.
And what happens if no one, I mean, banks aren't in the business of fixing roads and tunnels and stuff, so who would be then on the hook to?
Yeah, well, the banks stood behind they'd lent money to the consortium, so it just fell into their hands.
The banks fundamentally, two things. One, there was enough revenue that was being generated to pay for the operations of the road. There just wasn't enough to pay for the debt and the equity requirement. The banks have a fundamental one responsibility, but since they're going to be trying to sell it, they're going to keep it in the best condition possible so it has value instead of letting it deteriorate, which is effectively what they did.
Well, that works until you get too much housing stock in America that can't pay for itself and banks start to collapse in on top of each other. What keeps that from happening over here? I mean, what's the backstop for the bank?
Well, this has only happened on one project, and it wasn't drastic. I mean, the banks made the loans. They ended up with an asset. They managed the asset until they were able to on-sell it. But it was always going to be an attractive asset. And the buyers for these, the big investors, overwhelmingly, are investment pension funds that are looking at a long-term, utterly reliable asset. And given the growth in population, and Australia's population is growing at a very rapid rate, 2.1%, I think it's the highest in the developed world. Given the growth in population, the long-term prospect for toll roads in a big city are really positive.
If I can just add, I mean, each individual asset is created as a special purpose vehicle to where the bank can't pull money out of it and use it for other things. Since there were still 30,000 people using that road each day, there was revenue going into that account. So unless everybody stopped using that road, you really wouldn't run into that situation.
I think two of the important lessons that Bob brought here was the fact that when you have private sector investment, it is in their best interest to come in under budget and under deadline. And you obviously know that we're a free market organization, and this is the kind of approach that we support. And you know that when it's government behind the project, they have their hand in your pocket as long as they want. So this is one of the upsides of having that PPP, that private sector investment, that they have that profit, that for-profit incentive to come in under budget, under deadline, and as efficiently as possible. So I want to thank you so much for this interesting experience.